The fastest way to discover who someone really is to send them a bill they know they should pay. I still remember the sound of the laughter echoing across the clubhouse conference room when the Homeowners Association rejected my invoice. $22,000 sat neatly printed at the bottom of a professionally prepared statement, every expense documented, every repair photographed, every receipt attached in chronological order. I had not exaggerated a single penny. I was simply asking to be reimbursed for damage their failed drainage system had caused to my property after a spring storm turned a quiet hillside into a river of mud and debris. Susan Whitmore, the president of our Homeowners Association, barely glanced at the paperwork before sliding it across the polished oak table. She folded her hands, smiled the way only someone completely certain of their own authority could smile, and announced that the association accepted no responsibility for my repairs. Several board members nodded without reading the supporting documents. One even joked that perhaps I should have purchased better insurance. A few people chuckled politely. I did not. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, copier toner, and furniture polish, while sunlight streamed through the clubhouse windows overlooking the community lake everyone proudly called the heart of the neighborhood. Families fished there every weekend. Children learned to paddle kayaks there every summer. Holiday fireworks reflected across its calm water every 4th of July. The association printed photographs of that lake on nearly every newsletter they mailed. Susan loved standing beside it whenever local newspapers visited because she liked telling people how carefully the Homeowners Association protected its greatest asset. I quietly gathered my paperwork, placed every receipt back into my folder, and thanked the board for their time. Susan looked almost disappointed that I had not argued. She probably expected raised voices, threats, or dramatic speeches. Instead, I wished everyone a pleasant evening and walked outside into the cool mountain air. The breeze carried the clean scent of pine trees mixed with the damp smell of the lake after recent rain. I stood for a moment watching gentle ripples move across the water while geese drifted near the shoreline. Most people would have seen nothing except a peaceful neighborhood lake. I saw retaining walls, drainage channels, spillways, easements, permits, and engineering decisions hidden beneath the surface. Working as a civil engineer had taught me one lesson that never failed. Every beautiful landscape depends on invisible infrastructure. Ignore what lies underneath, and eventually the truth rises to the surface. As I climbed into my truck, I looked one last time toward the lake before driving home. I was not thinking about the $22,000 anymore. I was thinking about why Susan had been so confident. Confidence usually comes from believing you already know every fact. Overconfidence comes from never checking them. That night, I opened my laptop, spread county maps across my dining room table, and requested copies of property records I had not looked at since buying my land years earlier. I was not searching for revenge. I was searching for answers. 1 week after the board rejected my invoice, I mailed them another certified envelope. This one contained no bill, no demand for payment, and no angry letter. It contained something far more valuable. By the time Susan finished reading those pages, the $22,000 she refused to pay would become the smallest problem the Homeowners Association had ever faced. The county records office sat inside a plain brick building that most people drove past without noticing. But I had spent enough years working around engineering permits and land surveys to know that some of the most valuable discoveries in America lived inside rooms filled with old filing cabinets instead of vaults. The following morning, I arrived just after 8 o'clock carrying nothing more than a notebook, a laptop, and my original property deed. The clerk behind the counter greeted me with a friendly smile and asked what I needed. I explained that I wanted certified copies of every recorded document connected to my parcel, including easements, subdivision plats, utility agreements, drainage permits, and any historical surveys dating back to the original development of the community. She raised an eyebrow, smiled again, and said it might take a little while because some of the older documents had never been digitized. I told her I was not in a hurry. While she disappeared into the archive room, I studied the oversized subdivision map hanging on the wall. It showed every road, every lot, every utility corridor, and the lake that everyone in our neighborhood simply assumed belonged to the Homeowners Association. That assumption had always seemed reasonable because the clubhouse overlooked the shoreline. The association maintained the fishing dock, and every neighborhood event centered around the water. The annual picnic, the summer kayak race, The holiday lights reflected across the lake. All of it reinforced the same belief. Even I had accepted it without asking questions when I purchased my property years earlier. Engineers are trained to avoid assumptions, yet sometimes familiarity becomes its own blindfold. Nearly an hour later, the clerk returned pushing a cart stacked with oversized folders, rolled survey drawings, and faded record books that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. One by one, I began comparing maps created decades apart. Most of the documents matched perfectly, but small differences started catching my attention. A drainage easement shifted slightly between revisions. A maintenance note referenced a spillway instead of the lake itself. An old engineering sketch labeled a retaining structure with a parcel number that looked strangely familiar. I flipped back to my own deed and checked the legal description twice. Then I checked it a third time. My pulse slowed instead of racing because years of engineering had taught me never to celebrate until every measurement agreed with the evidence. I requested additional files connected to that parcel number, and another stack of documents arrived, including permits issued before the subdivision even existed. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the reading room, the picture became clearer with every page. The lake was not the original feature that created value for the neighborhood. The infrastructure beneath it was. The dam, the controlled spillway, and the drainage system had all been built around land that followed a very different chain of ownership than the community believed. I closed the final folder, carefully organized my notes, and requested certified copies of every relevant document. Walking back to my truck, I felt no excitement and no anger, only quiet certainty. Susan had rejected my invoice because she believed the association understood exactly what it owned. By the end of that afternoon, I knew there was a very good chance it did not. I spent the next several days verifying every document before making a single move, because one lesson every engineer learns is that facts matter far more than assumptions. Every survey line had to match. Every legal description had to connect. Every permit had to support the next page in the chain. By Friday afternoon, I had assembled nearly 3 inches of certified records across my dining room table. Old subdivision plats rested beside engineering drawings from the late 1960s. Drainage permits lined up with maintenance agreements. Survey coordinates matched property descriptions with surprising precision. The more I organized everything, the less complicated the story became. The neighborhood had always focused on the sparkling lake because it was beautiful, but the county records focused on something entirely different. They focused on the infrastructure that made the lake possible. The small earthen dam, the reinforced spillway, the underground drainage control system, and the maintenance access corridor all appeared repeatedly throughout decades of public records. What surprised me was where those structures actually sat. They were not centered on common property controlled by the homeowners association. Critical portions of the entire system crossed directly onto my parcel under agreements that had been negotiated long before the neighborhood existed. Those agreements were detailed, specific, and carefully written. They granted limited rights for maintenance and access, but they did not transfer ownership. More importantly, they required ongoing compliance with clearly defined conditions. Curious whether those conditions had ever been updated, I contacted the county engineering department and requested copies of every recorded amendment. The answer came back the following morning. There were none. Nothing had changed for decades. I also hired an independent licensed land surveyor to walk the property with me. We spent nearly 6 hours following old monument markers hidden beneath pine needles, measuring property corners, locating buried reference pins, and comparing field observations with the certified plats. Occasionally he stopped, adjusted his equipment, and repeated a measurement simply to eliminate any doubt. I appreciated that because certainty is earned through verification, not confidence. As the afternoon sun filtered through the tall evergreens, he finally lowered his equipment and looked directly at me. He said that if the county records were accurate, the engineering documents all agreed with what we had measured in the field. The homeowners association had every reason to maintain the lake, but maintenance was not the same thing as ownership. Those are two completely different legal concepts. Driving home that evening, I passed the clubhouse where families were preparing for the annual summer fishing tournament. Volunteers were hanging banners, arranging picnic tables, and unloading kayaks near the dock. Children laughed along the shoreline, while neighbors greeted one another without realizing that the foundation beneath their favorite gathering place was supported by legal agreements almost nobody had ever read. I did not feel satisfaction watching them enjoy the lake because none of this was their fault. They had trusted the same assumptions I once accepted myself. My disagreement was never with my neighbors. It was with a board that had dismissed documented facts without taking the time to understand them. When I pulled into my driveway, my attorney called with the final legal opinion I had been waiting for. After reviewing every certified record, every survey, and every applicable agreement, he quietly said something that changed everything. He told me the law appeared to be entirely on my side, and if the association refused to recognize those rights voluntarily, there was a straightforward legal process that would force them to do exactly that. My attorney moved with the kind of patience that only comes from decades of reading documents other people ignored. He refused to rely on assumptions, just as I did. Before we contacted the Homeowners Association again, he reviewed every certified survey, every engineering drawing, every recorded easement, and every maintenance agreement one final time. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, closed the last folder, and smiled. He said there was no need for a lawsuit because the law already provided a cleaner path. We simply had to follow it exactly. Over the next several days, we prepared a formal legal notice supported by county records instead of opinions. Every page referenced a recorded document. Every statement pointed to a survey. Every conclusion cited language that had been sitting in public archives for decades. There were no threats and no emotional arguments. The notice explained that the Homeowners Association had repeatedly exercised authority over infrastructure located on my property while refusing responsibility for the damage that same infrastructure had caused. It also explained that several access rights depended entirely on agreements requiring continued compliance with specific conditions. My attorney carefully emphasized that I was not attempting to prevent reasonable maintenance or create unnecessary conflict. I simply expected the existing agreements to be honored according to the law. The certified envelope arrived at the clubhouse 3 business days later. Susan signed for it herself. According to the delivery confirmation, she received it just before lunch. Less than an hour later, my telephone rang. She sounded calm at first, almost amused, asking whether I truly believed a collection of old records could change anything. I politely told her those records had never stopped being legally effective simply because everyone forgot about them. She insisted the lake belonged to the community and reminded me that the Homeowners Association had maintained it for years. I agreed that the association had maintained it, but maintenance and ownership were never the same thing. There was a long silence before she ended the call by saying their attorney would review everything. That was exactly what I wanted. The following week, survey crews hired by my attorney placed temporary reference markers along the recorded property boundaries surrounding the dam, spillway, and maintenance corridor. Curious neighbors gathered nearby asking friendly questions, and I answered every one of them honestly. I explained that I was confirming property lines after discovering discrepancies in historical records. Most people appreciated the straightforward explanation because they had no reason to suspect anything unusual beyond routine legal clarification. Susan, however, watched the survey from the clubhouse parking lot with folded arms and an expression that was noticeably less confident than before. For the first time since the board meeting, she no longer looked like someone completely certain of her position. She looked like someone waiting for information she wished had never existed. 2 days later, the association's attorney requested a meeting. Instead of arguing, he asked thoughtful questions about the engineering documents and the chain of recorded easements. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing maps spread across a conference table. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody interrupted. Every answer came directly from certified public records. When the meeting ended, he quietly admitted he needed additional time to verify several historical filings that had apparently never been considered during previous board transitions. As I walked outside into the crisp mountain air, I realized the conversation had finally shifted. This was no longer about a $22,000 invoice. It had become a question of who actually possessed the legal authority over the infrastructure that allowed the neighborhood lake to exist in the first place. The response from the association arrived 4 days later, and it was exactly what my attorney expected. Their lawyer did not dispute the authenticity of the county records, the surveys, or the engineering drawings. Instead, He argued that decades of uninterrupted maintenance had established practical control over the lake and its surrounding amenities. It sounded persuasive until you compared that argument with the actual documents. Property law does not change simply because people repeat the same assumption for many years. Recorded deeds, easements, and maintenance agreements continue to exist whether anyone remembers them or not. My attorney smiled as he finished reading the letter and said that the association had accidentally confirmed the most important fact in the entire dispute. They acknowledged maintaining infrastructure that was located on land they did not own. That distinction changed everything. We prepared one final notice, this time attaching the independent survey, the certified county records, and a proposed easement agreement that would allow the association to continue operating the dam, spillway, maintenance corridor, fishing dock, and community access exactly as before, provided they accepted responsibility for future maintenance obligations and reimbursed the documented repair costs they had previously refused to pay. The proposal was surprisingly reasonable. Nothing about daily life inside the neighborhood would change. Families could continue fishing. Children could continue launching kayaks. Holiday celebrations could continue beside the shoreline. The only difference was that the legal relationship would finally match the public records. Susan rejected the proposal less than 48 hours later. According to the official board response, the association believed my interpretation of the documents was incorrect and announced it would continue operating the lake exactly as it always had. My attorney quietly placed the letter on his desk, folded his hands, and asked me a simple question. Was I prepared to enforce the rights already recognized by law? I answered yes without hesitation because by that point this was no longer about recovering $22,000. It was about establishing that rules should apply equally to everyone, including the people who claimed to enforce them. The following week we filed the required legal notices with the county and recorded every supporting document exactly as the applicable procedures required. Nothing dramatic happened. No courtroom confrontation. No emotional speeches. The process moved forward through official filings, recorded acknowledgments, engineering reviews, and administrative confirmations. Each step quietly strengthened the legal foundation beneath our position. Meanwhile, life around the lake continued almost unchanged. Early every morning, I watched joggers circle the shoreline, while fishermen cast lines from the community dock. Lawn crews trimmed grass near the spillway. Maintenance workers unlocked equipment sheds without realizing they were crossing property governed by agreements their own board had refused to recognize. I never interrupted them because the legal process had not yet reached its conclusion. Then one Friday afternoon, my attorney received the final written determination from the county engineering department. After reviewing the historical permits, certified surveys, recorded easements, and ownership records, the department confirmed that continued access to critical portions of the lake infrastructure depended upon valid legal agreements with the owner of the affected parcel. Without those agreements, the association possessed no independent authority to occupy or manage those specific areas. My attorney looked across the conference table, slid the letter toward me, and quietly said that the balance of power had just changed. For the first time since Susan laughed at my invoice, I realized the lake had never been the true source of leverage. The real leverage had always been hidden beneath the water, recorded in documents that nobody had bothered to read until now. The county confirmation did not hand me ownership of the lake, and that was never the point. What it confirmed was something far more important. The Homeowners Association could not continue using critical portions of the infrastructure on my property without a valid agreement. For years, everyone had assumed those rights existed automatically simply because nobody had questioned them. The law does not operate on assumptions. It operates on recorded facts. My attorney immediately prepared the final documents. We recorded a formal notice clarifying that all future access to the dam, spillway, maintenance corridor, and supporting structures would require written permission until a new easement agreement was executed. Every page referenced the county findings, the certified surveys, and the original recorded instruments. There were no dramatic accusations and no demands beyond what the law already required. Early Monday morning, the notices were delivered to the association, the county engineering office, and every contractor responsible for maintaining the lake. By lunchtime, the first telephone calls began arriving. A landscaping company wanted to know whether their scheduled maintenance around the spillway should continue. A contractor responsible for inspecting the drainage system asked whether his access authorization was still valid. My attorney instructed each of them to pause any work until the legal questions were resolved because nobody wanted to unintentionally enter property without proper authorization. Within hours, the normally busy maintenance area became unusually quiet. For the first time in decades, the people responsible for operating the lake realized they could not simply proceed as if nothing had changed. That afternoon, I drove past the clubhouse on my way home. Several board members stood outside speaking with Susan beside the community bulletin board. Their expressions were serious rather than angry. I noticed survey maps spread across the hood of a parked vehicle while their attorney pointed toward the lake and then toward the wooded hillside where the spillway crossed my property. Nobody was arguing. They were trying to understand how something so important had remained unnoticed for so many years. The answer was simple. Every new board inherited assumptions from the previous one without tracing those assumptions back to the original records. As long as everything functioned normally, nobody felt any reason to verify the legal foundation beneath it. By Wednesday, the annual summer fishing tournament was only a few days away, and uncertainty had begun spreading through the neighborhood. Residents politely asked whether the event would still happen. I reassured everyone that I wanted the traditions to continue because I had no interest in disrupting the community. The only obstacle was the association's refusal to recognize agreements that should have been honored from the beginning. Late that afternoon, Susan requested another meeting. This time, her confidence had been replaced by careful professionalism. She placed a thick binder on the conference table containing decades of maintenance invoices, contractor payments, landscaping expenses, and improvement projects. She explained that the association had invested substantial money preserving the lake over many years. I agreed completely and acknowledged that the work had benefited every homeowner, including me. Then I slid the county determination across the table beside her binder. I quietly explained that responsible maintenance deserved respect, but it could never replace recorded property rights. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The room remained completely silent except for the faint sound of an air conditioning vent above us. Finally, Susan looked down at the documents, slowly closed her binder, and asked the question she had refused to consider only a few weeks earlier. She asked what it would take to resolve everything fairly and permanently. For the first time since this entire dispute began, the conversation was no longer controlled by assumptions or personalities. It was controlled by documents spread neatly across a conference table. Susan studied every page in silence while her attorney highlighted sections of the recorded easement agreements and compared them with the county engineering determination. Every few minutes, she looked toward the large windows overlooking the lake, almost as if seeing it differently than she had only weeks before. I understood why. For years, she had believed she was protecting one of the community's greatest assets. Now she was discovering that protecting something and legally controlling it were not always the same thing. My attorney finally broke the silence by presenting a revised agreement. It was remarkably straightforward. The Homeowners Association would receive a new recorded easement guaranteeing uninterrupted access to the dam, spillway, maintenance corridor, fishing dock, and all supporting infrastructure necessary for normal community operations. In return, the association would formally acknowledge the existing property boundaries, accept future maintenance responsibilities affecting my land, reimburse the documented $22,000 in repair costs, and establish clear engineering review procedures before making any future modifications impacting my parcel. Nothing in the proposal prevented families from enjoying the lake. Nothing interrupted community traditions. Nothing imposed unreasonable restrictions. It simply aligned decades of daily practice with the legal reality that should have existed from the beginning. Susan read the proposal carefully without interrupting. Her attorney asked several technical questions about maintenance schedules, emergency access, and inspection rights. Every concern already had an answer supported by engineering standards and recorded language. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, but unlike every previous board discussion, nobody argued. We solved problems one document at a time. By early evening, the framework of a final agreement had been completed, although the board still needed to approve it during a special meeting scheduled for the following night. News spread through the neighborhood much faster than I expected. Neighbors stopped me while I checked my mailbox or walked along the trail beside the shoreline. Most of them were surprisingly supportive once they understood the actual situation. They had assumed I wanted to close the lake or prevent people from using it. I explained that I had never asked for exclusive control of the water itself. My goal had always been accountability. If the association expected homeowners to respect property rights, then the association had to respect those same principles as well. Several longtime residents admitted they had never questioned who owned the underlying infrastructure because they simply trusted whatever previous boards had told them over the years. Hearing that confirmed something I had suspected from the beginning. The real problem had never been the neighbors. It had been institutional complacency. The following evening, the clubhouse meeting room filled with homeowners eager to hear the outcome. Susan stood before the audience with noticeably less confidence than usual, but far more honesty. She explained that extensive legal research had uncovered historical property records requiring the association to update several long-standing agreements. She acknowledged that the board should have investigated my original claim more carefully instead of dismissing it so quickly. No dramatic apology followed, and I did not expect one. Actions mattered more than speeches. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the board voted to authorize the new agreement and approve reimbursement for my documented repairs. As the meeting adjourned, I looked through the clubhouse windows toward the calm evening water reflecting the last light of sunset. The lake itself had not changed at all. The only thing that had changed was that everyone finally understood who actually held the legal keys supporting everything beneath its peaceful surface. The reimbursement check arrived by certified mail exactly 12 days after the board vote. I noticed the envelope sitting inside my mailbox before I even stepped out of my truck. It was thicker than an ordinary letter, carrying copies of the executed easement agreement, the official board resolution, and a cashier's check for $22,000 covering every documented repair expense I had submitted months earlier. I looked at the amount for only a moment before placing everything back inside the envelope. Surprisingly, the money no longer felt like the biggest victory. The real accomplishment was seeing a legal framework finally reflect reality instead of assumptions. A week later, the new easement was officially recorded by the county, replacing decades of uncertainty with language that left almost nothing open to interpretation. The maintenance corridor remained available to the homeowners association. Emergency access procedures were clearly defined. Engineering inspections required proper notice. Future infrastructure modifications affecting my property required written approval before construction could begin. Every responsibility now belonged to the correct party. There would be no confusion for the next board or the board after that. During the following weekend, I walked the trail surrounding the lake just after sunrise. The air carried the fresh scent of pine trees mixed with cool mountain water, and the surface of the lake reflected the orange glow of the morning sky almost perfectly. Families were already arriving with fishing poles, folding chairs, and small tackle boxes. Children laughed while tossing breadcrumbs toward a group of ducks near the shoreline. A father helped his daughter lower a bright red kayak into the water from the community dock. Watching them reminded me why I had never wanted to shut anything down. The lake belonged in the lives of everyone who called the neighborhood home. It simply deserved to exist under honest agreements instead of forgotten paperwork and misplaced authority. As I continued walking, Susan approached from the direction of the clubhouse carrying a folder beneath one arm. She greeted me politely, something she had rarely done before this entire situation unfolded. We stopped beside the fishing pier where the calm water gently touched the wooden posts beneath us. She admitted that after reviewing decades of archived records, she realized each new board had relied almost entirely on verbal explanations from previous volunteers rather than independently verifying historical documents. That habit had slowly transformed assumptions into accepted facts. I understood because organizations often inherit traditions much more easily than they inherit knowledge. She thanked me for insisting that everything be examined carefully, even though the process had been uncomfortable for everyone involved. I told her the community had actually benefited because future homeowners would never have to repeat the same expensive mistake. Before leaving, she smiled and said the association had already begun reviewing other historical easements throughout the neighborhood to make sure every public record matched current operations. Hearing that made the entire experience feel worthwhile. The dispute had started with one unpaid invoice, but it ended by improving the governance of an entire community. As I stood alone watching sunlight spread across the quiet lake, I realized nothing about the scenery had changed. The water was still peaceful. The dock still welcomed families. The trails still circled the shoreline. Yet beneath that familiar landscape rested something entirely different than before. This time, every inch of infrastructure, every maintenance responsibility, every access right, and every property boundary was supported by truth instead of assumption, and that foundation was far stronger than any argument ever could be. Several months passed before I truly understood what had changed. It was not the reimbursement check, the recorded easement, or even the legal recognition of the property rights that had existed all along. Those were important, but they were only the visible results. The real change was something far quieter. People in the neighborhood had started asking questions before making assumptions. New board members requested copies of historical records before approving maintenance projects. Contractors verified easement boundaries before bringing heavy equipment onto private land. Engineers reviewed drainage plans instead of relying on outdated sketches tucked inside forgotten filing cabinets. The entire community became more careful, not because anyone feared another dispute, but because everyone finally appreciated how easily small misunderstandings could grow into expensive mistakes when nobody bothered to read the original documents. Every time I walked around the lake, I noticed subtle reminders of that change. Small boundary markers had been professionally updated. Maintenance crews checked in before entering the access corridor. Inspection reports were shared openly with affected property owners. The process became transparent, predictable, and respectful. That was all I had wanted from the very beginning. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood near the spillway watching clear water flow steadily beneath the reinforced concrete structure that had quietly started this entire journey. Fallen leaves drifted across the surface, while the surrounding pine trees reflected brilliant shades of gold and deep green. Children laughed from the fishing dock in the distance as a family prepared a picnic beside the shoreline. Nothing about the lake looked different to anyone passing through the neighborhood. It remained the peaceful centerpiece everyone loved. Yet I knew the story hidden beneath that calm surface. I remembered the spring storm, the damaged hillside, the $22,000 in repairs, the laughter inside the clubhouse, the dusty county archives, the faded engineering drawings, the licensed surveyors carefully locating forgotten monument markers, and the long evenings spent comparing legal descriptions line by line. Every one of those moments had seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they revealed a truth that had been waiting patiently for decades. Susan and I crossed paths occasionally after everything was resolved. Our conversations became professional and surprisingly cordial. During one annual community meeting, she publicly introduced a new document review policy requiring future boards to verify historical records before making decisions involving common infrastructure. She never mentioned our dispute directly, but she did say that responsible leadership required humility whenever new information came to light. Hearing those words, I realized she had learned something valuable as well. Good leadership is not about pretending to know every answer. It is about being willing to correct mistakes once the facts become clear. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains that evening, the lake reflected the fading light with the same quiet beauty it always had. I smiled because people often tell this story as though I somehow took the lake away from the Homeowners Association. That was never true. I did not take anything from anyone. The law simply reminded everyone where the boundaries had always been. The lake never changed owners. The facts never changed either. The only thing that changed was that someone finally cared enough to read them. And sometimes justice is not about winning a fight. Sometimes it is about uncovering the truth that has been patiently waiting in plain sight all along.